Imagine waking up in a room full of crumpled papers, open books, and worn-out pens. Karl Marx used to begin his days among piles of manuscripts, always accompanied by the dense smoke of his inseparable tobacco. His mornings were not glamorous, like those of a celebrated philosopher, but rather those of a man in debt, with worn clothes and the noise of London filtering through the windows. His day did not start with order or calm, but with the feeling of racing against time and against his own problems. It was the daily life of a genius in the middle of chaos, without luxuries or silence, more like a rushed Monday of any ordinary person than the solemn image of a revolutionary thinker. Marx's breakfast was far from abundant. Many times there wasn't even anything to eat, since poverty relentlessly followed him. When he managed to get coffee or a bit of bread, that already felt like a luxury. The kitchen wasn't an orderly space with plates set on the table, but rather a constant improvisation. And even hungry, what dominated his mornings was the desire to work, the drive to write and read. The lack of resources didn't stop his passion. His first hours were marked by the urgency of putting his ideas on paper, as if every minute were vital. It's curious to think that one of the most influential intellectuals in history lived with such precarious and fragile routines. His workplace was neither beautiful nor grand. It was a cluttered desk that shared space with piles of unwashed clothes and his daughter's toys. Any visitor would immediately notice that mix between an improvised library and a chaotic household where papers blended with family life. Marx wrote surrounded by domestic bustle, children running around, arguments with his wife Jenny, and debts knocking at the door. Every page he put to ink was ripped from a chaotic environment, far from the usual serenity we imagine of a philosopher. And perhaps that was the spark. The daily coexistence between theory and reality, between the revolution written on paper and unresolved household problems. Punctuality was not exactly a rule in his days. Marx could spend entire days immersed in reading, forgetting about time as if the clock stopped before him. He would enter libraries and mentally disappear, exploring mountains of pages that today we would consider impossible to digest. He could be saturated with information and still crave more, frantically scribbling phrases, quotes, and figures. His days were marked by knowledge marathons, but while he devoured ideas, his family waited at home, often without a clear plan for food. That absurd contrast between intellectual depth and basic daily need reflected what Marx lived intensely, a thinker trapped between theory and survival. Money, or rather the lack of it, was a daily shadow. Marx easily accumulated debts and largely depended on the financial help of his inseparable friend, Friedrich Engels. It was common that his letters to Engels were filled with laments about bills, doctors, and rent. Money was never enough, and more than once the Marx family was on the verge of losing their home or facing the cold of winter without heat. However, that precariousness coexisted with a towering intellectual output. His ideas about capital were born while he counted his last coins, a striking irony that turned his daily life into a living laboratory of contradictions. Health was not his ally either. Marx suffered constant skin diseases and liver problems, which caused him pain and discomfort for much of the day. Despite this, he worked tirelessly, writing from early morning until well past midnight. He was a fragile body driven by an obsessed mind, and that combination unsettled those around him. There were days when he could barely stand, but still insisted on continuing. Doctors looked at him with concern, though he seemed to downplay it, convinced that writing and thinking were more important than self-care. His daily routine was marked as much by persistence as by self-destruction. His relationship with his family was intense and complex. His daughters adored him, but also directly experienced the harshness of poverty. The Marx household was often overcrowded, with frequent visits from friends and fellow revolutionaries, which added even more to the daily disorder. Jenny, his wife, was the great support of the household, often pawning valuable items to survive. Marx, in the midst of his writings, could be distracted and distant, but he found moments to play with his girls, telling them fantastic stories invented on the spot. That contrast between loving father and absorbed thinker created a bittersweet family atmosphere, where tenderness coexisted with despair. Coffee was an essential fuel in his daily routine. He could drink cup after cup, as if it were the engine of his ideas. For him, caffeine was a tool of resistance, a way to stay awake during his long nights of writing. That obsession took a toll on his health, but it fueled his intellectual productivity. Imagine those dawn hours, his worn pen consuming pages while the coffee cooled beside him, as his mind wove theories that would later shake entire governments. Marx's routine was not defined by fixed schedules, but by the intensity of his concentration and the power of coffee, which kept him going despite physical exhaustion. Tobacco smoke was also a permanent part of his daily atmosphere. Marx smoked in excess, letting the ash mix with the pages of his manuscripts. That smoke soaked everything: his clothes, the walls, even his daughter's toys. At first glance it may have seemed like just another vice, but in reality it became part of his creative process, as if the smoke accompanied the density of his thoughts. He fulfilled the cliché of the intellectual with a cloud of tobacco to the letter. It was so constant that those who visited him usually left his home imbued with the smell, as if they carried a piece of his intense, suffocating routine with them. Despite the disorder, Marx found in the British Museum a refuge of silence and knowledge. He spent hours there researching economics, philosophy, and history, as if it were his personal temple. He could be so concentrated that he even forgot to eat, letting his mind wander until exhaustion. That daily habit of escaping to the library allowed him to build the foundations of his most well-known works. The curious thing is that the genius of his theories was not born in a private laboratory or in a luxurious office, but at the silent tables of a public museum, sharing space with other readers. There, the revolution of ideas was taking shape within the seemingly ordinary routine of any given day. Loans were part of his calendar. He always owed something to someone, from the tailor complaining about worn suits to the baker waiting for overdue payment. Debt was a daily visitor at his door, reminding him that the theory of exploitation was something he personally experienced. Marx endured it with a bitter irony, aware that his intellectual brilliance did not guarantee stability at home. It's striking to think that the most read and debated pages of political thought were written between demand letters and arguments with collectors. One of his days could include drafting a revolutionary idea, as well as facing the bitter reality of a creditor knocking at the door. Nighttime was the most fertile moment for his production. While the rest slept, he would light the lamp again and resume his feverish writing rhythm. He could go hours without lifting his head, focused on shaping complex theories while London slept around him. The silence of the early morning became both an ally and an enemy, as physical fatigue clashed with a mind that refused to stop. Thus, his routine was a nocturnal spiral that transformed the most silent hours of the day into fertile ground for intellectual revolution. While others rested, Marx built sentences that would later become conceptual dynamite against the structures of power. His normal days also included gatherings with friends and comrades. Endless conversations about politics, literature, or economics filled the small rooms of his house. Engels, of course, was the recurring figure, sustaining his inseparable companion with both money and ideas. Those discussions were not casual chats, but true storms of collective thought. Between laughter, tobacco, and shared despair, arose the foundations of projects that would later define whole movements. What's striking is that this revolutionary brainstorming took place in a household on the verge of financial collapse, at cluttered tables surrounded by papers and glasses of cheap beer. Intellectual revolution was born amid confidences and almost improvised debates. A normal day in Marx's life could easily turn into a whirlwind of contradictions. Between poverty and genius, family noise and academic concentration, his daily life resembled a draining roller coaster more than an orderly routine. There was no fixed plan or master clock, only a torrent of work, arguments, illnesses, and debts. Each day was the living reflection of his concepts: constant struggle, permanent tension, irreconcilable contradictions. That daily life, so far from comfort, shows us that behind the myth of the philosopher was a man who survived like anyone else, with chaotic days that, without knowing it, were writing an eternal chapter in world history.